Oakland, California, March 22nd, 1945, early afternoon. In a cramped office on the second floor of the Naval District headquarters, a woman sits with a pen hovering over a clean sheet of paper. Before her lies the transcript of a closed military proceeding. She's reading it for the third time. Her hands don't shake. Her face remains calm, almost detached. She knows that every word in this document is a lie. She knows because 3 hours ago she translated the witness's testimony herself, and he said something entirely different. Now she needs to sign, confirming that the translation is accurate. The pen weighs nothing in her hand, a standard-issue Navy fountain pen, black enamel worn smooth where fingers grip it. She's held this pen 1,000 times, signed her name on 1,000 documents. But this signature will be different. This one will transform her from witness to accomplice, from translator to collaborator in murder. She picks up the pen. She writes her name, letter by letter. Estelle Vogel. The signature falls onto the paper evenly, without smudges, each letter formed with the precise discipline her father taught her when she was 7 years old. Write as if your name is your promise, he'd said. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, one, underscore, underscore. No one in the room knows that in her handbag, beneath a German grammar textbook and a subway token, and a half-eaten sandwich wrapped in waxed paper, lies a composition notebook where she recorded word for word what the witness actually said. No one knows she just signed her own death warrant. The ink dries. The document is now official. 3 men will stay dead. 6 others will rot in prisons they don't deserve. And Estelle Vogel, who once believed that truth was sacred and words had weight, has just certified a lie that will outlive them all. Part 1. The Education of Estelle Vogel. Estelle was born in 1917 in a Milwaukee household where 3 languages were spoken and silence was considered a virtue. The Vogel residence at 1247 Juneau Avenue was a 3-story brownstone with high ceilings and rooms that always smelled of paper and ink. Her father, Friedrich Vogel, was a technical translator from German to English, specializing in engineering manuals and patent applications. Her mother, Marie Beaumont Vogel, taught French literature at Milwaukee Downer College, a women's institution where young ladies learned to conjugate Molière and discuss Flaubert without blushing. From childhood, the girl grew up surrounded by dictionaries and grammar guides, among people for whom words had weight, precision, value. The breakfast table was a linguistic laboratory. Friedrich would read aloud from German newspapers, pausing to discuss grammatical constructions. Marie would recite Baudelaire while preparing dinner, her accent flawless, her voice turning mundane vegetables into poetry. Young Estelle absorbed language the way other children absorbed fairy tales. By age 6, she could switch between English, German, and French mid-sentence, selecting words with the instinct of a jeweler choosing gems. But more than fluency, she learned precision. Her father taught her. Quote, 2. She remembered this forever, not knowing that one day, this rule would place her before an impossible choice. The Vogel household was orderly, intellectual, and emotionally restrained. Friedrich had emigrated from Bavaria in 1908, bringing with him the rigid discipline of his upbringing. He was not unkind, but neither was he warm. He showed affection through correction, fixing Estelle's grammar, improving her pronunciation, teaching her to think in multiple languages simultaneously. When she performed well in school, he would nod once, precisely, and say, "Gut." That single word was worth more than 1,000 embraces from another father. Marie was warmer but distant in her own way, perpetually absorbed in her academic work. She treated Estelle less like a daughter and more like a promising student, someone to mold and educate. Their conversations were Socratic dialogues, question and answer, analysis and interpretation. Emotional displays were considered vulgar, a failure of self-control. Estelle learned early to read, to observe, to think before speaking. She learned that intelligence was valued above all else, that precision mattered, that feelings were private things best kept locked away. She became the kind of child adults praised as mature for her age, and other children avoided as strange. In school, Estelle was the quiet girl teachers rarely called on, not because she didn't know the material, but because they simply didn't notice her. She sat in the third row by the window, took meticulous notes in 3 different colored inks: black for facts, blue for questions, red for connections between concepts. She got A's on every test, but her name never echoed in school assemblies. She was never chosen as class representative, never invited to student council. Estelle was invisible, and this suited her. She understood early that being unnoticed was protection, a way to avoid attention, questions, judgment. In a world where immigrant children were mocked for their parents' accents, where being different meant being vulnerable, invisibility was armor. She had one friend during childhood, a girl named Ruth Kowalski, whose family had come from Poland. They bonded over their foreignness, over having parents who spoke English with thick accents, over knowing what it felt like to exist between worlds. They would meet at the public library on Saturday afternoons, reading side by side in companionable silence, occasionally sharing discoveries: a poem, a paragraph, a perfectly turned phrase. But when Estelle was 14, Ruth's family moved to Chicago. They promised to write, and for a few months they did, long letters full of observations about books and weather and the small injustices of high school life. But gradually the letters grew shorter, less frequent, and finally stopped. Estelle learned another lesson. People leave, connections fade, and ultimately you can only rely on yourself. After high school, she enrolled at the University of Wisconsin. She chose German as her major, French as secondary, and filled her electives with linguistics, philosophy, and literature. English was the language of her future, the language of opportunity and assimilation. German was her father's tongue, the language he taught her from picture books about dark forests and crumbling castles, about brave tailors and clever millers' daughters who outwitted kings. French was her mother's gift, the language of Baudelaire and Rimbaud, whose verses she memorized in her teenage bedroom, whispered to herself like prayers. University opened worlds to her. She discovered that her gift for languages was rare, valuable. Professors noticed her, recommended her for advanced seminars, suggested she consider graduate school. For the first time, Estelle felt seen, not as a person exactly, but as a mind, an intellect worth cultivating. She lived in a women's dormitory, sharing a small room with a cheerful girl from Minnesota who talked incessantly about boys and dances and movie stars. Estelle would sit at her desk late into the night, translating Goethe and Verlaine while her roommates slept, finding in those foreign words a kind of music that made sense of the world. In 1939, she graduated summa cum laude, first in her class. She was 22, and the world of possibilities stretched before her. She could work at a publishing house, teach at a university, work for the State Department. Her professors wrote her glowing recommendations. Graduate programs accepted her with full scholarships. But then something happened that changes the fates of quiet girls who aren't supposed to step into life's spotlight. She fell in love. Part 2. Warren. Warren Fletcher was 8 years her senior, a naval engineer who worked on ship modifications at the Mare Island shipyard near San Francisco. Tall, lean, with prematurely graying temples and the tired eyes of a man who'd seen too much. They met by chance at a bookstore in San Francisco, City Lights, the famous literary haven where Estelle had gone to browse the poetry section during a visit to her mother's college friend. It was late afternoon in June. Estelle was reading Rilke, her fingers tracing the German text, when someone knocked into her from behind. Her bag fell, spilling books across the floor. Rilke, a French dictionary, a copy of the Brothers Karamazov, and a paperback mystery she'd bought on impulse at the train station. Quote, 5, a male voice said. She looked up to see a man crouching to gather her books. He picked up the Rilke and paused, reading the spine. Then, in nearly perfect German, he read aloud. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 6, underscore, underscore. I live my life in widening circles. Estelle's breath caught. She responded automatically, in German, die sich über die Dinge ziehen. That spread over things. He smiled, a real smile, tired but genuine. You know Rilke? He's worth knowing, she said, and immediately felt foolish. But Warren didn't seem to notice. Quote, 10, quote, he said, switching to English, extending his hand. Quote, 11, quote. They stood there in the narrow aisle of the bookstore, surrounded by towers of books, and talked. He told her about studying engineering in Germany before the war started brewing, about falling in love with the language and the literature. She told him about her parents, about translation, about the way different languages revealed different truths. They talked until the store owner politely suggested they leave so he could close up. On the sidewalk outside, Warren said, quote, 12, quote, 13, quote, Estelle said. They married 6 months later. The wedding was modest, held in a small courthouse with 2 witnesses, Warren's colleague from the shipyard and Estelle's mother, who attended with compressed lips and a fixed smile that didn't reach her eyes. Marie thought her daughter was making a mistake, marrying instead of pursuing graduate school, settling for domesticity instead of intellectual achievement. But Estelle didn't care. For the first time in her life, she felt fully seen, fully known. Warren understood her silences, her need for solitude, her passionate attachment to words. He read German poetry to her in bed. They discussed philosophy over dinner. He taught her about ships and engineering, the mathematics of stress and load-bearing, and she was fascinated by how similar it was to language, finding the right structure to carry meaning, ensuring nothing collapsed under the weight of what it had to bear. Warren's parents had passed away years before, his mother from influenza in 1918, his father from a stroke in 1935. He had no siblings, no extended family. Like Estelle, he was fundamentally alone in the world, and this shared solitude became the foundation of their marriage. They didn't need anyone else. They had each other, and their books, and their conversations that ranged from the sublime to the mundane and back again. The young couple rented a small apartment in Oakland near the shipyard, furnished it with bookshelves they built themselves from scrap lumber, and believed that happiness was morning coffee together and evening conversations about Goethe and whether the universe was deterministic or allowed for free will. Estelle found work at a small German-language newspaper, translating articles about events in Europe as the situation deteriorated. She watched through the lens of language as war approached, reading between the lines of propaganda and official statements, seeing the truth that casual readers missed. Warren worked long hours at the shipyard as the Navy began expanding its Pacific Fleet. They had 14 months together. 14 months of quiet domestic happiness, of shared breakfasts and late-night conversations, of Saturday afternoons browsing used bookstores, and Sunday mornings reading the newspaper in bed. 14 months of believing that the world was safe and good, that love was enough, that nothing truly terrible could touch them. But happiness proved short-lived. On October 17, 1940, Warren died. Industrial accident at the Mare Island shipyard, that's what the report said. Welding torch explosion in Dry Dock 2, 3 dead, 5 more injured. Warren Fletcher, age 31, naval engineer. Cause of death? Severe burns and smoke inhalation. Time of death? 3:47 p.m. Estelle was at home when the Navy chaplain arrived. She was translating an article about Kristallnacht, trying to find English words adequate to describe the horror. She heard the knock, opened the door, and knew immediately. The chaplain's face told her everything. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 14, underscore, 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 he said. Just those 2 words. She didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't faint. She stood in the doorway and said, "Thank you for informing me," as if he'd delivered the mail. The chaplain seemed unsettled by her composure. He asked if she had family to call, friends who could stay with her. She said yes, she was fine, thank you, good day. Then she closed the door, walked to the bedroom, lay down on the bed where Warren's scent still lingered, tobacco and salt air and the machine oil that never quite washed out of his work clothes, and stayed there for 3 days. She didn't eat, didn't change her clothes, didn't answer the door when neighbors knocked. She lay there breathing in what remained of him, trying to understand how the world could continue existing when Warren Fletcher no longer did. On the fourth day, she got up. She bathed. She dressed in black. She attended the funeral at the Naval Cemetery, stood by the grave in a black hat with a veil, dry-faced and stone-still, watching as they lowered the casket into the earth. People whispered that it wasn't right, that a young widow should weep, but Estelle remained silent. Her grief was too deep for tears, too fundamental to express in gestures that other people would understand. After the funeral, she returned to their empty apartment. The books were still on the shelves. His coffee cup was still in the sink. His reading glasses were still on the nightstand, next to the Rilke collection he'd been working through. The apartment held him everywhere she looked, and nowhere at all. She sat on the bed and understood that she had to survive. Not for herself. She didn't particularly want to survive. But for him. For his memory. She couldn't allow herself to break, to become one of those widows who fade away into grief until they're ghosts haunting their own lives. Warren would have hated that. He believed in reason, in discipline, in the importance of carrying on. So Estelle made a decision. She would survive by not feeling. She would turn herself into a machine, precise and functional, performing her duties without the burden of emotion. She would translate words, earn money, maintain her existence. She would live, in the technical sense, without actually being alive. She found work within a month. The Navy's Western District Court needed a translator for German. With war looming and German prisoners beginning to arrive, with immigrants under suspicion and surveillance, someone who could bridge languages was valuable. The pay was modest but steady, $65 a month, enough for rent and food and nothing else. But Estelle didn't need anything else. She arrived at the interview in a severe gray suit she'd bought at a second-hand shop, her hair carefully pinned in a bun, her face composed and professional. The presiding officer, a heavy-set man with ribbons on his chest and broken capillaries in his nose, was Judge Commander Thomas Hartwell. He looked at her diploma, her letters of recommendation, asked 2 questions in German, the first about her background, the second about a complex grammatical construction to test her fluency. She answered both flawlessly. Quote 16, he asked, noting her ring. Quote 17. Quote 18. Quote 19. He studied her face, looking for signs of instability, emotional fragility. But Estelle had perfected the mask. Her expression revealed nothing. Quote 20, he asked. Quote 21. Thus, in December 1940, at age 23, Estelle Vogel became a military court translator. For more than 4 years, she would come to this building, a gray stone structure near Lake Merritt that smelled of floor wax and cigarette smoke, and the particular staleness of rooms where difficult decisions were made. She climbed to the second floor every morning at 8:30, sat in her corner of the courtroom, and translated. Part 3. The Machinery. The work was exactly what Estelle needed: mechanical, precise, emotionally neutral. She translated testimony of witnesses who spoke poor English. She translated confessions of defendants, lawyers' arguments, judges' verdicts. She was an invisible bridge between 2 worlds, 2 languages, and her voice sounded as if she weren't human, but a mechanical device for transmitting meaning. The first case she worked was routine. A sailor accused of being drunk and disorderly in port. He was German-American, spoke English with such a thick accent that normal court proceedings were impossible. Estelle sat in her chair and transformed his slurred, emotional protestations into clear, neutral English. He was found guilty, sentenced to 30 days restriction. When the gavel fell, Estelle felt nothing. This, she realized, was how she would survive: by feeling nothing, by being nothing more than a conduit for words. The courtroom became her world. She learned its rhythms, its rituals, its cast of recurring characters. Judge Commander Hartwell presided over most cases, stern and humorless, a man who believed in discipline above mercy. Lieutenant Commander Morrison prosecuted, aggressive and ambitious, building his career on conviction rates. The defense attorneys rotated, mostly young officers doing their mandatory legal service before returning to sea duty. Estelle learned all procedures by heart, memorized legal terms in both languages, learned to translate automatically without thinking. It was like meditation. Words entered one ear, transformed in her consciousness, and emerged from her mouth in another language. Pure mechanics. No emotions, no judgments. Her colleagues barely noticed her. The court clerks greeted her out of politeness. "Morning, Miss Vogel," but never stopped to chat. Prosecutors nodded when they needed her to begin translating, ignored her when they didn't. Judges occasionally thanked her for her work, but no one's gaze lingered on her. Estelle was part of the furniture, like the desk, like the flag in the corner, like the portrait of FDR on the wall. And this suited her perfectly. She developed a routine that protected her from thought. Wake at 6, dress in one of her 3 identical gray suits, eat toast and black coffee while reading the newspaper without absorbing any information. Walk to the Naval District building, arriving at exactly 8:25. Spend 5 minutes in the women's restroom, checking that her hair was neat, her face composed, her stockings straight. Enter the courtroom at 8:30, take her seat, open her notebook, uncap her pen. Court sessions ran from 9 a.m. to noon, broke for lunch, resumed at 1:30, ended at 4. Estelle brought her lunch, usually a sandwich made the night before, and ate alone in a small park near the building, reading whatever book she'd brought. German poetry mostly. Hölderlin, Goethe, Rilke. The familiar rhythm soothed something in her that she refused to acknowledge was pain. At 4 o'clock, she walked home, stopping at the grocer to buy exactly what she needed for dinner. Pot roast on Mondays, vegetable soup on Tuesdays, chicken on Wednesdays, and so on through the week, a predictable rotation that required no decisions. She cooked on the hot plate in her apartment, the same apartment she'd shared with Warren, which she couldn't bear to leave because it held the last traces of him. Evenings she spent reading and translating. Not legal documents, she did enough of that at work. But poetry, literature, the texts that had first taught her to love language. Sometimes she would translate the same poem 3 different ways, trying to capture not just the meaning but the music, the rhythm, the particular emotional resonance of the original. This was her prayer, her meditation, her only remaining connection to the person she'd been before Warren died. She had no friends. There were acquaintances, Mrs. Chen, who lived in the apartment below and sometimes brought her soup, the grocer who saved her fresh bread on Thursdays, the librarian who ordered rare books for her through interlibrary loan. But friends, those to whom she could open her soul, she had none. Estelle had learned to live in solitude, like a monk in a cell, and this solitude became her fortress. She wrote letters to her mother once a month, brief reports on her health and work that revealed nothing about her inner life. Marie wrote back with equal brevity, discussing her classes and the books she was reading. They never mentioned Warren. They never discussed emotions. The letters were formal exchanges of information between 2 women who happened to share blood, but little else. The first years of work were her salvation. Each morning she woke with the sense that she had purpose, a place she needed to go. The court became her refuge from the emptiness of widowed life, but it also made her complicit in a system she didn't fully understand. Most of the cases were minor: drunk and disorderly, insubordination, petty theft, unauthorized absence. She translated testimony mechanically, signed documents certifying accuracy, forgot the cases as soon as they were concluded. The defendants blurred together, young men mostly, scared or defiant or simply resigned to whatever punishment came. But some cases were different. Cases that made her pay attention, that penetrated her carefully constructed numbness. November 1942. A sailor named Edwin Pritchard, 24 years old, accused of desertion. He was brought in wearing handcuffs and a uniform that hadn't been washed in weeks. Dark circles under his eyes, hands shaking. When they asked him to testify, he broke down, sobbing, saying he couldn't go back to the ship. He couldn't face his commanding officer. He'd rather go to prison. Lieutenant Commander Morrison asked why. Pritchard hesitated, then started talking. He spoke of systematic extortion, of Lieutenant Arnold Keene demanding money from enlisted men, threatening them with false charges if they refused to pay. Pritchard said he'd paid at first, $5 a week, nearly half his pay. But he had a sick mother in Ohio who needed medicine. He couldn't afford to keep paying. So he'd gone AWOL, hoping to find help, to report Keene through proper channels. Estelle translated every word. She wrote it in her notebook, shorthand marks supplemented with key phrases. She watched Morrison's face as she translated, saw something flicker there. Not surprise exactly, but awareness. He knew. Of course he knew. The prosecutor called a recess. When court resumed an hour later, Pritchard's testimony had somehow been reinterpreted. Morrison suggested that the stress of naval service had caused Pritchard to develop paranoid delusions, to imagine persecution where none existed. The defense attorney, a baby-faced ensign who looked barely old enough to shave, put up no fight. The official transcript, which Estelle was asked to review and sign at the end of the day, made no mention of Lieutenant Keene or extortion. It presented Pritchard as having confessed to desertion with no mitigating circumstances. She stared at the typed pages, seeing the gap between what she'd heard and what had been recorded. She should have said something, should have pointed out the discrepancy. But Judge Hartwell was watching her with those cold, evaluating eyes, and she heard Warren's voice in her head. Don't make trouble. Don't draw attention. Survive. She signed. That night she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about Edwin Pritchard's terrified face, his shaking hands. Thinking about how easily truth could be erased, how simple it was to transform testimony into fiction. She got up at 3 a.m., sat at her kitchen table, and opened a new composition notebook, one she'd bought weeks ago for translating poetry but never used. She wrote the date, November 17th, 1942. Then she wrote everything she remembered from Pritchard's actual testimony, reconstructing it from her stenographic notes and her memory, which was near perfect when it came to language. She didn't know why she was doing this. Didn't know what she planned to do with this record. But some instinct told her it mattered, that bearing witness mattered, even if the witness could do nothing with what she'd seen. Pritchard was sentenced to 5 years hard labor at a military prison in Kansas. Estelle learned this from a clerk who mentioned it casually while discussing the next day's docket. 5 years. For trying to escape extortion. She kept the notebook hidden in her apartment, tucked behind the complete works of Goethe on her bookshelf. And she waited, dreading and somehow knowing that this wouldn't be the last time she'd need it. Part 4. The 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th. April 1943. A civilian dock worker named Miguel Santos, accused of theft of military property. Middle-aged, Mexican-American, wore a faded work shirt and had calloused hands from years of manual labor. He spoke English but with an accent that made some of the court officials impatient. When asked what happened, Santos explained carefully, methodically, that he'd witnessed a Navy supply officer, Lieutenant Raymond Walsh, selling fuel and spare parts to black market dealers. Santos had worked the night shift and seen the transactions happen after hours, trucks arriving with no paperwork, money changing hands, supplies disappearing from inventory. He'd reported it to his supervisor, who told him to mind his own business. He'd reported it to the shore patrol, who took a statement and did nothing. Then, 2 weeks later, Santos was arrested. They found stolen property in his locker, spare parts, tools, materials he swore he'd never seen before. He'd been framed, he said, obviously framed. He had a wife, 3 children. He'd worked at that shipyard for 14 years. Why would he risk everything to steal a few tools? Estelle translated, wrote it down, watched Morrison's face remain impassive. During the recess, she saw Morrison in the hallway talking quietly with a Navy captain she didn't recognize. They looked at her once, briefly, then returned to their conversation. The official transcript said Santos confessed to theft, 3 years in federal prison. His family lost their home. Estelle wrote the truth in her notebook that night. 2 cases now, a pattern emerging. September 1943. A wave named Dorothy Sullivan, 26, accused of conduct unbecoming. She was composed during her testimony, hands folded in her lap, voice steady but with an underlying tremor that suggested enormous effort to maintain control. She testified that she'd been assaulted by Captain Gerald Whitmore during a late-night inventory shift. She'd reported it immediately to her commanding officer, who suggested she'd misunderstood the captain's intentions, that she was young and perhaps overly dramatic. When she persisted, insisting she wanted formal charges filed, she found herself accused of making false accusations and conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. The defense attorney, not the usual baby-faced ensign but an older officer with dead eyes, suggested that Dorothy had engaged in consensual relations and then regretted them, invented the assault story to avoid responsibility for her own poor judgment. He asked invasive questions about her social life, her relationships, implied she was promiscuous. Morrison piled on, painting her as emotionally unstable, pointing to the fact that she'd seen a Navy psychiatrist once after her mother died, clearly evidence of mental fragility. The official transcript said Dorothy admitted to consensual relations and false reporting. Dishonorable discharge. Future employers would see that discharge status for the rest of her life. Estelle wrote it down. 3 cases. January 1944. A merchant marine named Harold Chen, Chinese-American, born in Seattle, accused of espionage. The evidence against him was absurd. He'd been seen talking to another Chinese man at a restaurant in San Francisco. That man turned out to have distant relatives in China. Therefore, potentially suspicious contact with foreign nationals. Harold testified that he'd been detained solely because of his ethnicity. He'd been born in America, graduated from high school in Seattle, had 2 brothers serving in the Army, one in Europe, one preparing for the Pacific Theater. He'd never been to China. He barely spoke Chinese. But he looked Chinese, and in 1944, that was apparently enough. The transcript said he admitted to suspicious contacts, interned indefinitely at a facility in Nevada. Estelle wrote it down. 4 cases. July 1944. A Navy machinist named Leonard Kozlowski accused of sabotage. Polish immigrant, thick accent, hands scarred from years of metalwork. He testified that he'd reported safety violations in the torpedo workshop, faulty pressure gauges, inadequate ventilation, violations of protocol that could get men killed. His supervisor, Chief Warrant Officer Dale Hammond, told him to shut up and do his job. 2 weeks later, defective parts were found in Kozlowski's locker. Parts that would have caused catastrophic failure if installed in a torpedo. Parts that Kozlowski swore had been planted, that he'd never seen before, that he wouldn't have recognized as defective anyway. That was the Quality Control Department's job, not his. The transcript said he confessed to deliberately manufacturing faulty components. 10 years in military prison. Estelle wrote it down. 5 cases. She was keeping a record of atrocities now. Not the grand atrocities happening in Europe and the Pacific, concentration camps and firebombing and mass murder, but small bureaucratic atrocities. The kind where forms were filled out properly, where protocols were followed, where injustice wore the mask of legality. She started having nightmares. Not about Warren. She rarely dreamed of him anymore, as if her subconscious had accepted what her conscious mind refused to admit, but about the people whose testimony she'd translated, whose lives she'd watched destroyed by lies she'd certified as truth. Edwin Pritchard in his prison cell. Dorothy Sullivan trying to find work with a dishonorable discharge. Harold Chen behind barbed wire for the crime of being Chinese. She started drinking. Not heavily, she couldn't afford to lose control, but enough to sleep. A glass of whiskey before bed, sometimes 2. Just enough to quiet the voices. She grew paranoid, began to wonder if they knew about her notebook, if someone had searched her apartment while she was at work. She moved the notebook to different hiding places, behind books, under the mattress, in the flour canister. Eventually, she settled on the loose floorboard under her bed, wrapped the notebook in oilcloth to protect it from moisture, and tried to forget it existed. But she couldn't forget. The notebook was physical evidence of the truth, and keeping it was the only act of resistance she was capable of. She was too afraid to speak, too paralyzed by the knowledge of what would happen if she did. But she could write. She could bear witness. She could preserve the record, even if no one ever saw it. Part 5. Klaus Reinhardt. March 21, 1945. The war in Europe was ending. Allied forces were crossing the Rhine. Victory was inevitable, just a matter of time. In the Pacific, Iwo Jima had fallen at terrible cost. B-29s were firebombing Japanese cities. The end was coming there too. Estelle received the summons at her desk during lunch break. Tomorrow, March 22nd, 10 a.m., courtroom number 2. Closed military proceeding. Case of special significance. Her presence mandatory. She read the notice 3 times, feeling cold spread through her chest. Closed proceedings were rare. Special significance even rarer. This was going to be bad. That night, she barely slept. Lay in bed listening to the sounds of the building, pipes creaking, neighbors walking, the distant sounds of traffic on Telegraph Avenue. She thought about running. Just not showing up, leaving Oakland, disappearing. But where would she go? She had no money, no family, no connections. And they'd find her. Deserting a military court summons during wartime was a federal offense. So she went. March 22, 1945, exactly at 10 o'clock, Estelle entered courtroom number 2. A small, airless room with no windows, located in the basement of the Naval District building. She'd never been in this room before. It was reserved for the most sensitive cases, the ones that couldn't be allowed even the filtered daylight of the regular courtrooms. At the table sat 3. Judge Commander Hartwell, Prosecutor Lieutenant Commander Morrison, and a court clerk, a young woman named Alice with a tense face and hands that trembled slightly as she organized papers. In the corner by the door stood 2 shore patrolmen, big men with expressionless faces. Security, protection, warning. Estelle sat in her designated chair, took out her notebook, her official notebook, not the hidden one, and her pen. __quote _23 __. Judge Hartwell addressed her, his voice flat and formal. The door opened. They brought him in, a man around 50, in a wrinkled shirt that had once been white, unshaven, with dark circles under his eyes so deep they looked like bruises. His hands were cuffed in front of him. He walked with the shuffle of someone who'd given up. They sat him on a chair facing the judge. The guards remained standing nearby, hands near their service revolvers. "State your name," said the judge. The man was silent. His gaze was empty, absent, like a man who'd long ago stopped fighting. Quote, 30 quote, the judge repeated, sharper this time. The man muttered something in German. His voice was hoarse, barely audible. Estelle leaned forward slightly. Quote, 31 quote. The judge nodded. Quote, 32 quote. Klaus answered in German. Estelle translated. Quote, 33 quote. Mare Island. The words hit Estelle like a physical blow. The same shipyard where Warren had died. The same docks, the same machinery, the same place where her husband had burned to death 5 years ago. For a moment she couldn't breathe, couldn't focus. The courtroom seemed to tilt around her. Quote, 34 __, the judge was saying. Estelle forced herself to concentrate, to translate. Quote, 35, quote, 36. Klaus spoke. Estelle translated. Quote, 37, quote. The judge made a note, then, quote, 38, quote. Klaus raised his head. Something alive flickered in his eyes. Fear, desperation, a pleading that made Estelle's stomach tighten. Ich weiß nicht, he said in German. Ich will mich nicht erinnern. I don't know. I don't want to remember. Estelle translated. He says he doesn't remember. Prosecutor Morrison stood. He was a tall man, thin, with the kind of angular face that looked harsh even in repose. He approached the witness, placed a photograph before him. Estelle couldn't see what it showed from her position, but she saw how Klaus's face contorted, how his whole body recoiled. "Do you remember now?" Morrison asked. Klaus closed his eyes. His lips moved, whisper quiet, a prayer or incantation in German. Estelle caught fragments. "Vergib mir. Gott vergib mir. Forgive me. God forgive me." "Answer the question," Morrison said. Klaus opened his eyes. He looked not at Morrison or the judge, but at Estelle, as if she alone might understand, as if shared language meant shared humanity. Then he began to speak. Slowly, with long pauses, as if each word caused physical pain, and Estelle listened, her pen moving across paper, her voice translating simultaneously, professional even, betraying nothing of the horror she felt. Klaus spoke about being called out at night to the shipyard, the same shipyard where Warren had died, the same docks, the same darkness. Estelle felt the past and present collapsing into each other, felt vertigo, nausea. But she kept translating, kept writing, kept her voice steady. Klaus said his supervisor, Chief Petty Officer Vincent Callahan, had telephoned him at home around midnight, said there was an emergency, he needed to come in immediately, couldn't explain over the phone. Klaus had arrived at Dry Dock 3 around 1 a.m. The dock was mostly empty at that hour, skeleton crew, just essential personnel. Callahan was waiting by the gangway. With him were two other sailors, Petty Officers Gerald Marsh and Robert DeWitt. All three were wearing work clothes, not uniforms. Callahan led Klaus to the edge of the dry dock, near the stern of the destroyer USS Halford, which was undergoing repairs. That's when Klaus saw them. Three men, Japanese-American, on their knees with their hands bound behind them with rope. They were young, 20s, maybe early 30s. They wore civilian work clothes. One was bleeding from his mouth. Another had a swollen eye. Estelle translated all this, her voice steady, making notes in her shorthand. She didn't look at Klaus's face. Couldn't bear to see the expression there. Klaus testified that Callahan told him these three men were internees from the Tanforan Assembly Center who'd been assigned to the shipyard under the wartime labor program. Said they'd been caught attempting to sabotage the USS Halford's propeller shaft. Said they'd been trying to damage the shaft so it would fail at sea, maybe cause the ship to sink, kill American sailors. Said this was proof that all Japanese were traitors, that even the ones born here couldn't be trusted, that they were enemies and had to be dealt with as such. Klaus testified that he asked Callahan if the military police had been notified, if there would be a proper investigation. Callahan laughed, said there was no point involving the MPs, no point in a trial. Said everyone knew how it would end anyway. Japanese were Japanese. They were all guilty. Better to handle it quietly. Klaus testified that he protested. He switched to German, thinking maybe Callahan would listen to him in private language, man to man. "Das ist Mord," he said. "This is murder. Wir können das nicht tun. We can't do this." But Callahan spoke some German, enough to understand. He grabbed Klaus by the shirt and said, quote 47 __. Klaus testified that he fell silent. He was afraid. He thought about his wife, his two children. He thought about what would happen to them if he ended up at the bottom of the bay. So he stood there and watched. Callahan and the other two sailors dragged the three Japanese-American men to the very edge of the dock. The men were crying, begging in English, saying they hadn't done anything. They were innocent. Please don't do this. They had families. They were Americans. Klaus gave their names. He'd heard Callahan use them mockingly before it happened. Thomas Nakamura, James Fujimoto, Henry Tanaka. What happened next, Klaus described in a monotone, staring at nothing. Marsh and DeWitt struck the three men repeatedly with metal pipes. the kind used for scaffolding repairs, until they stopped moving, stopped making sounds. Then they weighted the bodies with chains from the machine shop, and they pushed them into the water of the dry dock, which had been partially flooded for pump testing. Klaus testified that he heard the splashes, 3 separate splashes, one after another. The water was dark and oily, lit only by work lights from the ship. He couldn't see the bodies sink, but he heard the chains dragging them down. Callahan told Klaus that if he ever spoke about this, he'd end up in the water too. Said no one would believe a German immigrant over American sailors. Said this was war, and in war, you did what you had to do to protect your country from enemies within. Said the 3 men had been saboteurs, and what happened to them was justice. Klaus testified that he went home that night and vomited until there was nothing left in his stomach. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't look at his wife without seeing those 3 faces. He started drinking to forget. Lost his job when he showed up drunk to a shift. His wife left him, took the children. He ended up living in a flop house, drinking whatever money he could scrape together. In early March, he was arrested for public intoxication and disorderly conduct. When the shore patrol brought him in, something broke inside him. He started talking, confessing, saying he knew about deaths, 3 deaths. He couldn't keep it secret anymore. He wanted those men to be found, to be buried properly, to have their names spoken aloud. He wanted someone to know what happened. He wanted justice. That's what Klaus Reinhardt said. Every word of it. Estelle heard it all, translated it all, wrote it all down in her notebook in stenographic marks that captured every detail. When Klaus finished, the room was silent. Even the guards looked shaken. Judge Hartwell called a recess. They led Klaus out. He walked like a dead man, empty, hollowed out. Estelle remained sitting. Her hands were cold. Her mouth was dry. She stared at her notes, seeing the words, understanding what they meant. 3 men murdered. Their bodies still in the water at Mare Island, the same shipyard where Warren had died, where she'd stood by his grave 5 years ago. And she was the only other person besides Klaus and the killers who knew the truth. She understood with absolute clarity that she'd just heard something she wasn't supposed to hear, something that powerful men would kill to keep secret. 20 minutes passed. The judge returned alone. He handed Estelle a typed transcript, multiple pages, crisp and official-looking. "Check the translation," he said. "Sign on the last page." Estelle took the transcript with numb fingers, began reading, and with each line, her heart beat louder, her hands grew colder, her breathing became shallower. This wasn't what Klaus had said. This wasn't even close. Part 6. The Lie. The official transcript was a masterpiece of bureaucratic fiction. It had the right format, the right headers, the right legal language, but the content was completely different from what Estelle had heard, translated, and recorded. According to the official version, Klaus Reinhardt testified that on the night of February 18, 1945, he was called to the Mare Island Naval Shipyard to assist with a minor industrial accident. A crane cable had snapped while lifting materials in Dry Dock 3, and several workers had been injured by falling debris. Klaus helped call for medical assistance. The injured workers, names not specified, were treated by Navy medical personnel and released. Minor injuries, nothing serious. The accident was determined to be the result of equipment fatigue, normal wear and tear. No negligence, no safety violations. Routine incident. Klaus's employment was terminated on February 19th due to ongoing issues with attendance and job performance, unrelated to the accident. His subsequent arrest for public intoxication was similarly unrelated. His statements to Shore Patrol about quote, _50__ were determined to be alcoholic delusions, the product of a disturbed mind and substance abuse. Medical examination confirmed that Klaus Reinhardt was suffering from acute alcohol dependence and possible mental illness. His testimony was deemed unreliable. Case closed. That's what the official transcript said. 23 pages of careful lies, typed neatly on Navy letterhead, formatted according to proper legal standards. Anyone reading it would see a straightforward incident report, documentation of a minor accident and a mentally ill man's false accusations. 3 murdered men erased, reduced to unnamed quote 51 who'd been treated and released, their bodies still rotting underwater, while the official records said they'd walked away with bandages and bruises. Estelle sat in that airless room, the transcript in her hands, and felt the world narrow to a single point of decision. She could sign this document and live, or refuse to sign and die. Maybe not immediately, maybe not literally, but her life would end in every way that mattered. She thought about Edwin Pritchard, Dorothy Sullivan, Harold Chen, all the others. The pattern was clear now. This was how it worked. Truth was spoken in courtrooms, then erased in transcripts. Witnesses testified, then recanted or disappeared. Justice was performed in public and murdered in private. And she, Estelle Vogel, translator, widow, keeper of secrets, she was the hinge on which this machinery turned. Without her signature, the lie remained unofficial. With it, the lie became truth, became part of the permanent record, became history. She looked at Judge Hartwell. He was watching her with those cold, evaluating eyes that had seen this before, that knew exactly what they were asking her to do. Quote 52. Her mouth was dry. She swallowed, tried to speak, found her voice. Quote 53. Quote 54. Her hand moved, not because she decided to move it, because her body, trained by years of obedience and fear, moved automatically. The pen touched paper. Her signature began to form. She should have refused, should have stood up, thrown the transcript in Hartwell's face, shouted that it was all lies, demanded they record the truth. Should have been brave like the heroes in the books she loved, like the people who stood up to injustice in the German poems her father had read to her as a child. But Estelle Vogel had spent her whole life being invisible, being careful, avoiding trouble. And in that moment, facing those cold eyes and knowing what refusing would cost her, knowing that they'd destroy the notebook and silence her and nothing would change except that she'd be dead or imprisoned, she did what she'd always done. She survived. The signature fell onto the paper evenly, without smudges. Estelle Vogel, certified translator. Each letter perfect, each stroke precise, the habits of a lifetime making even this act of cowardice look professional. Quote 55 Hartwell said. He took the transcript from her, placed it in a folder marked classified. Quote 56, quote 57, quote 58. Estelle's voice came out steady, dead. I'll be prosecuted for treason, capital offense during wartime, life imprisonment after. Exactly. You're a smart woman, Miss Vogel, smart enough to know when silence is the price of survival. You've survived this long. It would be a shame if anything happened to you now. The threat was explicit, clear, unmistakable. I won't speak of classified information, sir. I signed the oath. I'll honor it. See that you do. Estelle gathered her things, her notebook with Klaus's real testimony, her pen, her handbag, walked out of the courtroom on numb legs that somehow carried her weight. Outside, the clerk Alice handed her a document to sign, the security oath. Estelle read it without comprehending, signed without thinking. Alice gave her a carbon copy. Estelle folded it mechanically, put it in her handbag next to the notebook that held the truth. She walked out of the Naval District headquarters into the bright Oakland afternoon. March sunshine, warm on her face. People walking past, going about their lives. Sailors on shore leave, laughing, smoking cigarettes. Women with shopping bags heading home to make dinner. Children playing hopscotch on the sidewalk. The ordinary world completely unchanged. But Estelle had changed. She walked to the nearest streetcar stop on autopilot, sat on the wooden bench, People came and went around her, boarding streetcars, getting off, consulting schedules. She sat there for an hour, maybe more, watching them without seeing them. Finally, she opened her handbag, looked at the composition notebook. 140 pages. She'd been keeping it for more than 4 years, since that first case with Edwin Pritchard. At first, it was just a backup, a way to double-check her work, ensure she hadn't made translation errors. But gradually it became something else. A record, a testimony, a secret history of injustice. Most of the cases were routine, nothing that mattered. But there were 6 cases now, 6 that did matter. 6 cases where truth was spoken and lies were recorded. 6 cases where justice died. She pulled out her pen, turned to a fresh page, and began to write. Not in shorthand this time, but in full sentences, complete and clear. She wrote everything Klaus Reinhardt had said, every detail of his testimony, reconstructing it from her stenographic notes while the memory was fresh. She wrote for an hour, cramped handwriting filling page after page. When she finished, her hand ached, but she had it all. The complete, true testimony. The names: Thomas Nakamura, James Fujimoto, Henry Tanaka. The location: Dry Dock 3, Mare Island Naval Shipyard, the same place where Warren had died. The perpetrators: Chief Petty Officer Vincent Callahan, Petty Officers Gerald Marsh and Robert DeWitt. The date: February 18, 1945. Evidence: documentation, truth preserved in ink. But what could she do with it? Who could she tell? She'd signed the security oath. Speaking was treason. And even if she were willing to risk execution, who would believe her? A widow translator with no connections, accusing decorated Navy personnel of murder? Against their denials, against the official record, against the entire machinery of military justice, they'd destroy her, destroy the notebook, and nothing would change. So she made a decision. She would wait. She would keep the notebook safe. She would preserve the truth until the time came when it could be told. Maybe after the war ended. Maybe years from now. Maybe never. But she would keep the record, because bearing witness was the only resistance she had left. The streetcar came. Estelle boarded it, clutching her handbag with the notebook inside. Rode home in silence, watching Oakland pass by outside the windows. Her city, familiar and alien at once. Part 7. The Hiding. Estelle lived in the same Oakland apartment she'd shared with Warren, on the 3rd floor of a 4-story building at 847 Telegraph Avenue. The building was old but well-maintained, with high ceilings and creaky floors and radiator heat that clanked all winter. She'd lived there for 5 years, knew every sound, every smell, every crack in the plaster. She climbed the stairs, 38 steps, she'd counted them many times, unlocked her door with the key that stuck slightly in the lock, entered the apartment that held all that remained of her old life. Books on shelves, Warren's photograph on the mantel, the one from their wedding day, both of them young and hopeful and believing the world was good. The typewriter where she sometimes practiced translations, German to English and back again, polishing phrases until they sang. She went to the bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed, still holding her handbag. For a long time, she just sat there, unable to move, unable to think. Then she stood, pushed the bed aside. It scraped across the floor, loud in the quiet apartment. There was a floorboard that had always been loose, that squeaked when you stepped on it. She'd meant to fix it for years, but somehow never had. She pried up the board with a butter knife from the kitchen. Beneath was a space, maybe 6 inches deep, running between the floor joists. Just large enough. She went to the kitchen, found the oilcloth she used to wrap food for storage. Wrapped the notebook carefully, tightly, to protect it from moisture and time. The package was about the size of a novel. She placed it in the space beneath the floorboard. It fit perfectly, as if the space had been designed for this exact purpose. She replaced the floorboard, pushed the bed back into position, stood looking at the room, which appeared completely normal, completely unchanged. The truth was hidden now, safe, secret. And then she broke. She sat on the bed and cried for the first time since Warren's funeral. Not the quiet tears of normal grief, but racking sobs that shook her whole body, that left her gasping for air. She cried for Klaus Reinhardt and his impossible burden, cried for Thomas Nakamura, James Fujimoto, and Henry Tanaka, who died for nothing, whose bodies were still in the water at the place where Warren had died. Cried for Edwin Pritchard and Miguel Santos and Dorothy Sullivan and Harold Chen and Leonard Kozlowski, whose lives had been destroyed by lies. Cried for herself, for her cowardice, for the fact that she'd signed the lie, made herself complicit, for the fact that she was too afraid to speak, too broken to fight. But after the tears came something else, a cold, hard resolution. She would survive this. She would keep living. She would keep the notebook safe, and someday, somehow, the truth would come out. Maybe not in her lifetime, maybe not for decades, but the record would survive, and that would have to be enough. Part 8. The Haunting. The next 8 months were the hardest of Estelle's life, harder even than Warren's death, because at least that grief had been clean, comprehensible. This was different. This was living with the knowledge of murder, living with complicity, living in constant fear. She continued working at the military court. What choice did she have? She needed the money, needed the routine, needed something to fill her days besides terror and guilt. But she was never the same. She jumped at sudden noises, a door slamming, someone calling her name unexpectedly. She had nightmares almost every night, bodies in dark water, Klaus Reinhardt's hollow eyes, Judge Hartwell's cold smile. She'd wake at 3 a.m. drenched in sweat, certain they were coming for her. She started drinking more. Not falling down drunk, she couldn't afford to lose control, but enough to quiet the fear, enough to sleep for a few hours before the nightmares returned. A glass of whiskey before bed became 2 glasses. 2 became 3. She started keeping a bottle in her desk at work, taking small sips throughout the day to steady her nerves. She became paranoid, began to believe they were watching her, that they'd searched her apartment and found the notebook. She'd come home to find her books slightly out of place. Or was that just her imagination? The floorboard under her bed seemed looser than before. Or had it always been that way? She started checking the hiding place compulsively, 2, 3 times a day, just to make sure the notebook was still there. She changed her routines, stopped going to her usual restaurant for lunch, took different routes home from work every day, kept her door locked at all times, even when she was inside, started sleeping with a kitchen knife under her pillow. People at work noticed she was different, but no one said anything. Estelle had always been quiet, reserved, separate. If she became more so, well, that was her business. She saw Klaus Reinhardt one more time. July 1945, late afternoon. She was walking past the Oakland police station on her way home and recognized him coming out, escorted by shore patrol. 2 sailors, one on either side, gripping his arms. Klaus looked worse than he had in March, gaunt, hollow-eyed, like a walking skeleton. Their eyes met for a moment. Just a moment, a few seconds. But in that look, Estelle saw everything. Recognition, understanding, a kind of terrible fellowship. They were bound together now, she and Klaus, 2 people who knew the truth and couldn't speak it, 2 witnesses carrying unbearable knowledge. She thought she saw gratitude in his gaze, maybe just acknowledgement, or perhaps just resignation, the look of someone who'd given up hoping for rescue. She wanted to call out to him, to say something, to acknowledge what they shared. But the shore patrol was moving him along, and Estelle's voice wouldn't work. She stood frozen on the sidewalk, watching them take him away. 2 weeks later, July 29, 1945, she heard through courthouse gossip that Klaus Reinhardt was dead. Apparent suicide, they said. Found hanging in his cell at the Treasure Island Naval Prison. Used his own shirt, braided into a rope. The guards had been changing shifts, no one watching for those 15 minutes. Tragic. But perhaps for the best. The man had been clearly disturbed, suffering from alcoholic delusions. Estelle knew it was murder. Knew they'd silenced him. Knew that they'd made it look like suicide because that was tidier, easier to explain. And she knew, with cold certainty, that she might be next. She became more paranoid, stopped going anywhere except work and home, bought groceries at a different store every week, started carrying a hat pin, sharp and lethal if wielded correctly, checked over her shoulder constantly, lay awake at night listening for footsteps in the hallway, ready to run. She wrote a letter, brief, factual, explaining about the notebook and where it was hidden, sealed it in an envelope addressed __, quote, _63__. Kept it in her handbag at all times. If they killed her, maybe someone would find it. Maybe the truth would come out anyway. Then, on August 15th, 1945, the war ended. VJ Day. Japan surrendered. The city erupted in celebration. Church bells ringing, car horns honking, people dancing in the streets, strangers kissing, sailors hoisting girls onto their shoulders, champagne bottles opened and sprayed into the air. Estelle stood at her window watching the celebration, feeling nothing but hollowness. The war was over, millions dead. But for Klaus Reinhardt and Thomas Nakamura and James Fujimoto and Henry Tanaka, what did it matter? Their war had ended in murder and lies, and no peace treaty would bring them back. Part 9. The Escape. The war's end changed nothing at the military court. Estelle had harbored some dim hope that peacetime might bring accountability, that without the pressure of wartime secrecy, truth might matter again. But the machinery ground on exactly as before. Cases were still being falsified. She saw it happen twice more in August, once in September. Different details, different defendants, but the same pattern. Testimony altered, records changed, truth erased. She couldn't do this anymore. Couldn't keep signing lies. Couldn't keep living in terror. Something had to change. In October 1945, Estelle requested a transfer. She went to Judge Hartwell's office, that same office where he'd warned her about silence being the price of survival, and said she needed a change of scenery for health reasons. She'd been having headaches, she said. Her doctor recommended a different climate. Perhaps she could transfer to a Navy facility in a different state. Hartwell studied her for a long moment. Estelle kept her face neutral, her hands still, her voice steady. "Your health," he said finally. "Yes, sir." "And nothing to do with the cases you've translated?" "No, sir. I understand my obligations under the security oath." Another long pause. Then, "Very well. I'll approve your transfer request. Where would you like to go?" "Anywhere, sir. Wherever there's a need for translators." "I'll see what I can find." But Estelle never waited for his response. 2 days later, she submitted her resignation, gave 2 weeks' notice. Said she'd decided to pursue other opportunities, that the military court had been valuable experience, but she wanted to try something different. They accepted her resignation without question. Translators were always in demand elsewhere, especially now that the occupation forces needed people who spoke German and Japanese for rebuilding efforts. They probably thought she was heading overseas, chasing better pay. She worked her last 2 weeks translating minor cases, routine stuff, nothing that haunted her. On her final day, as she was cleaning out her desk, Judge Hartwell summoned her to his office one last time. She went, her pulse hammering but her face calm. Quote, 71, he said. Quote, 72. Quote, 73. Quote, 74. He was looking at her intently, and Estelle understood this was more than a reminder. It was a threat. They knew she knew, and they'd be watching. "I understand, sir." "I hope you do. You're a smart woman, Miss Vogel. Smart enough to know that sometimes silence is the price of survival. You've survived this long. It would be a shame if anything happened to you now. The threat was explicit, clear, unmistakable. I won't speak of classified information, sir. I signed the oath. I'll honor it. See that you do. Estelle left that office, left that building, walked down those stairs for the last time, and never looked back. She found work at a small publishing house, Hartman & Sons, German Literature and Translation. They needed someone to translate contemporary German writers into English for the American market. The pay was less than the Navy had provided, but it was enough. More importantly, it was safe. No courtrooms, no lies, no complicity in murder. She moved to a different apartment, across town in the Rockridge neighborhood. Couldn't bear to stay at 847 Telegraph anymore, surrounded by ghosts. But she couldn't retrieve the notebook without arousing suspicion. If anyone was watching her, and she had to assume they were, going back to her old apartment, prying up floorboards would be a clear signal that she'd hidden something. So the notebook stayed where it was. The landlord assumed she'd cleared everything out, rented the apartment to new tenants, a young couple, newlyweds, working class. They moved in, never knowing what lay beneath their bedroom floor. Estelle tried to start fresh. Small apartment, quiet job, careful routine. She worked 9 to 5 translating German novels, post-war literature most of it, stories of loss and guilt and trying to rebuild. She was good at it. The work was challenging enough to occupy her mind, straightforward enough not to torment her. But she never stopped thinking about the notebook. It became her talisman, her burden, her secret purpose. She was its guardian, and that gave her life meaning even when everything else felt empty. Part 10. The Long Silence. Years passed. Estelle lived a small, careful life. She never married again, though occasionally men expressed interest. She was still attractive in her 30s and 40s, small, precise, with intelligent eyes and a quiet dignity. But she couldn't imagine letting someone that close, couldn't bear the idea of trying to explain why she woke screaming from nightmares, why she sometimes stopped mid-sentence and stared at nothing, remembering. She never spoke about her wartime service. When people asked what she'd done during the war, she said she'd been a translator for the Navy, routine office work, very dull. No one pressed for details. She continued her work at Hartman & Sons, advancing to senior translator, then managing editor. She was respected, valued, given more responsibility. The Hartman family, Jewish émigrés who'd escaped Germany in 1938, treated her with kindness, genuine appreciation for her skill. It was good work, honorable work, making German literature accessible to American readers. But the ghosts never left her. In 1956, she was reading the San Francisco Chronicle over breakfast when she saw a brief item in the obituaries. Vincent Callahan, Commander USN retired, died at his home in Monterey, California, age 63. Survived by his wife and 3 children. Decorated veteran, exemplary service record, full military honors at his funeral. Estelle read it 3 times. Vincent Callahan, who'd beaten 3 men to death and thrown them in the water. Vincent Callahan, who'd threatened Klaus Reinhardt into silence. Vincent Callahan, who'd lived another 11 years, raised a family, died peacefully in his bed, and was honored as a hero. She threw up her breakfast, went to work an hour late, couldn't concentrate all day. In 1963, Judge Commander Thomas Hartwell's obituary appeared. Died peacefully in his sleep, age 78, surrounded by family. Respected jurist, 30 years of military service, buried with full honors at the Presidio National Cemetery. Estelle went to the cemetery the next day, stood at his grave, looking at the fresh flowers, the American flag, the headstone that praised his integrity and dedication to justice. She wanted to scream, wanted to dig up his corpse and drag it through the streets, wanted to stand on his grave and shout the truth about what he'd done, how he'd perverted justice, how many lives he'd destroyed. But she stood silent, because that was what she did. That was all she'd ever done. Part 11. The Disease. In 1982, at age 65, Estelle was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Stage 4, the doctor said gently. There were treatments they could try, but honestly, at this stage, they wouldn't do much. She had perhaps 6 months, maybe a year if she was lucky. Estelle wasn't sure whether she considered that lucky or not. She declined aggressive treatment. No point in making herself sick for a few extra months. She'd arrange for hospice care when the time came. Until then, she'd continue working as long as she could manage. She told no one at work about the diagnosis, just said she was taking some medical leave, would work reduced hours. They were understanding, concerned. She'd been with the publishing house for 37 years. They'd make accommodations. The cancer progressed quickly. By summer, she was in constant pain, managing it with increasing doses of morphine. By fall, she couldn't work at all, could barely leave her apartment. She thought constantly about the notebook. It was still there, under the floorboards at 847 Telegraph Avenue, 3 miles and an entire lifetime away. She'd checked on it once, years ago, 1960, after the landlord had died and the building changed hands. She'd visited during an open house for prospective buyers, asked to see the third-floor apartment, checked the bedroom. The floorboard was still loose. The notebook was still there, wrapped in oilcloth, waiting. Now she was dying, and the notebook would outlive her. But what good would it do? Who would find it? The building was old, probably would be torn down eventually. The notebook would be destroyed along with the structure, and all that truth would be lost forever. She had to do something. But what? She was too sick to travel, too weak to retrieve the notebook herself. And even if she could, who would she give it to? Newspapers? Would they believe it? Government officials? Would they care? She spent her last months in bed, tended by a rotating roster of hospice nurses. The morphine made her thoughts drift, made time elastic. Sometimes she thought Warren was in the room with her, reading Rilke aloud. Sometimes she was back in that airless courtroom, watching Klaus Reinhardt's hollow eyes. On December 2nd, 1982, in a moment of clarity between morphine doses, Estelle asked the hospice nurse for paper and pen. The nurse, a kind woman named Constance Reed, brought her a pad of paper and a ballpoint pen. Estelle wrote for an hour, her handwriting shaky but legible. 3 pages. She addressed it, "To whom it may find this," and dated it. She wrote about the notebook, about where it was hidden, 3rd-floor apartment, 847 Telegraph Avenue, Oakland, under the bedroom floorboards. She wrote about the 6 cases, listed the names of all the victims. She wrote about Klaus Reinhardt's testimony, about the 3 murdered men whose bodies were still in the water at Mare Island. She wrote, __quote _80___. She signed it, sealed it in an envelope, asked Constance to file it with her personal effects to make sure it went to whoever handled her estate. Constance promised she would, but when she read the letter later, she thought it was the rambling of a dying woman, confused by pain medication. The story seemed impossible. Murders at a naval shipyard, conspiracies, hidden notebooks, clearly the product of a fevered, failing mind. She filed it with Estelle's papers as promised, but she didn't believe a word of it. Estelle Vogel died that night, December 3rd, 1982. She was alone, the way she'd been alone most of her life. The hospice nurse found her in the morning, cold and still, her face finally peaceful. Part 12. The Silence. After Estelle was buried in Mountain View Cemetery, Oakland, next to Warren Fletcher. A small funeral. A few people from Hartman and Sons. No family. Her mother had died in 1965. The hospice nurse attended out of professional courtesy. The eulogy was brief, generic. Estelle Vogel, translator, scholar, devoted to literature and language. A quiet life, well lived. No mention of the Navy, of wartime service, of secrets carried to the grave. Her apartment was cleared out by the landlord. Her books went to a used bookstore. Her furniture was sold. Her personal papers, including the letter she'd written, were boxed up and placed in storage with a lawyer's office to be disposed of after the statutory period for unclaimed estates. The apartment at 847 Telegraph Avenue continued being rented. The young couple moved out eventually, replaced by a student, then an elderly widow, then a series of others. None of them knew what lay beneath their bedroom floor. None of them heard the ghosts that lived there. The building stood for another 32 years, slowly deteriorating. The neighborhood changed around it, gentrifying, modernizing, rents increasing. By 2010, 847 Telegraph was an anachronism, a crumbling relic too expensive to maintain. In 2013, the building was condemned. Structural damage, outdated wiring, plumbing failures. The cost to renovate exceeded the building's value. Demolition was scheduled for June 2014. Part 13. The Discovery. June 15, 2014. A construction crew from Martinez Demolition and Salvage arrived at 847 Telegraph Avenue at 7 a.m. They'd been contracted to tear down the building, clear the lot, prepare it for a new mixed-use development. Condos on the upper floors, retail on the ground level. The usual Oakland story. The crew chief, Marcus Williams, was a third-generation construction worker. His grandfather had built houses in Oakland after World War II. His father had worked on the Port of Oakland expansion in the 60s. Marcus knew the bones of this city, understood the archaeology of buildings, what they revealed about the people who'd lived in them. They started on the 4th floor, working their way down, standard demolition procedure. Gutted the interiors first, removing anything salvageable. Copper pipes, hardwood floors, light fixtures that might have value to restoration enthusiasts. By afternoon of the second day, they reached the 3rd floor. Marcus was prying up floorboards in what had been a bedroom, small room, 10 by 12, one window facing the street. The boards were original, probably 80 years old, worn smooth by decades of footsteps. One board was looser than the others. When Marcus pried it up, he saw something underneath. An oilcloth package, yellowed with age. He pulled it out carefully, unwrapped it. Inside was a composition notebook, the cheap kind students used in the 1940s. The pages were yellowed but readable, the ink still clear. Marcus sat down on what remained of the floor and opened the notebook. The first page read, Private Translation Record, Estelle Vogel, September 1941. Then, in smaller script, official transcripts may not reflect testimony. This record preserves what was actually said. Marcus started reading. Got through 3 pages before he realized what he was holding. Stopped. Carefully wrapped the notebook back in the oilcloth. Took it home. Part 14. The Reckoning. That evening, Marcus showed the notebook to his wife, Terry, who taught history at Oakland Technical High School. She opened it and couldn't stop reading. The meticulous handwriting, the dates, the names, the dual accounts, official version on the left page, actual testimony on the right. Case after case, documented with precision. And then, starting on page 90, the Klaus Reinhardt case. The testimony about the 3 murdered men. The names, Thomas Nakamura, James Fujimoto, Henry Tanaka. Terry had taught World War II history for 15 years. She knew about the internment camps, the injustices against Japanese Americans. But this was something else. This was documentation of murder, preserved by a Navy translator who'd been forced into silence. She called a colleague, Dr. Raymond Chen, who taught at UC Berkeley's history department. He came to their house that night, read the notebook, and immediately recognized its significance. Quote, 83, quote, he said. Quote, 84, quote. They contacted Dr. Patricia Morrison at UC Berkeley's Bancroft Library, a specialist in wartime California history. She examined the notebook, ran preliminary tests. The paper was consistent with 1940s composition notebooks. The ink was period appropriate. The handwriting showed no signs of modern forgery. Most importantly, the content was verifiable. Every name mentioned in the notebook could be fact-checked against military records. Over the next 6 months, Dr. Morrison and her team investigated. They found Edwin Pritchard, real person, court-martialed for desertion, November 1942, sentenced to 5 years hard labor, died in 1987 in Ohio, never spoke publicly about his service. Miguel Santos, real person, convicted of theft of military property, April 1943, served 3 years in federal prison, lost his family home, died in 1972 in Los Angeles. Dorothy Sullivan, real person, dishonorably discharged from Waves, September 1943, struggled to find employment for years due to discharge status, died in 1998 in Seattle. Harold Chen, real person, born Seattle 1919, had 2 brothers in the Army. Interned as suspected foreign sympathizer, January 1944. Released in 1946 after spending 2 years in detention. Died in 2001 in San Francisco. Leonard Kozlowski, real person, convicted of sabotage, July 1944. Served 10 years in military prison, released in 1954, deported to Poland. Died in 1976 in Warsaw. Klaus Reinhardt, real person, German immigrant, worked at Mare Island Naval Shipyard. Died in custody at Treasure Island Naval Prison, July 29, 1945. Official cause of death, suicide by hanging. And then the breakthrough. In Mare Island Naval Shipyard records, they found documentation of 3 Japanese-American workers who'd gone missing in February 1945. Their families had filed missing persons reports. The Navy's official position was that the 3 men had deserted their labor assignments, presumably fled to avoid being returned to internment camps. The men's names: Thomas Nakamura, age 27, James Fujimoto, age 31, Henry Tanaka, age 24. No investigation had ever been conducted. The men were simply listed as deserters. Their families told nothing. Dr. Morrison contacted the families, or what remained of them. Nakamura's sister was still alive, aged 91, living in Sacramento. Fujimoto's daughter, who'd been 2 years old when her father disappeared. Tanaka's nephew. They all said the same thing. The men would never have deserted. They were loyal Americans. They'd volunteered for the labor program to prove their loyalty, to support the war effort despite the injustice of internment. They'd written letters home, talked about coming home after the war. They wouldn't have run. The notebook was authenticated. Carbon dated, handwriting analyzed by forensic experts. Every detail checked against military archives. It was genuine. They found Estelle's personnel file in Navy archives, her employment record, her security oath from March 22, 1945, the Klaus Reinhardt case. The signature matched the one in the notebook perfectly. And then, in a storage facility in Oakland containing unclaimed estate materials, they found Estelle's final letter. To whom it may find this. Written 3 days before her death, explaining about the notebook, begging someone to make the truth known. The hospice nurse who'd thought it was delusional rambling was tracked down, still alive at age 74. She read the letter again, now understanding it was all true. Quote 86, she said. Quote 87. Part 15. Justice Delayed. In January 2015, the story broke. The San Francisco Chronicle ran it as a front-page investigation. Quote 88, quote. The national media picked it up. New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, NPR. The story had everything. Wartime injustice, murder, a brave translator preserving truth despite threats, a decades-long cover-up finally exposed. The Navy was forced to open an official investigation. They located the original classified files from the Klaus Reinhardt case, found Estelle's signed security oath, found the falsified transcript she'd signed. The discrepancies between her notebook and the official record were undeniable. Pressure mounted. Japanese-American advocacy groups demanded answers. The families of the 3 murdered men demanded their bodies be recovered, given proper burial. In March 2015, a Navy dive team searched the waters at Mare Island Naval Shipyard's Dry Dock 3, which had been decommissioned in the 1990s. They found remains. 3 sets of human bones weighted with chains. Forensic analysis confirmed they'd been in the water since approximately 1945. DNA testing matched the remains to living relatives of Thomas Nakamura, James Fujimoto, and Henry Tanaka. The investigation expanded. They looked into the other cases documented in Estelle's notebook. Official records were unsealed, testimony reviewed. In every case, they found the same pattern. What Estelle had documented as actual testimony revealed truths that contradicted the official transcripts. The Navy assigned investigators to track down everyone involved. Vincent Callahan, died 1956. Gerald Marsh, still alive, age 92, living in a nursing home in San Diego. Robert DeWitt, still alive, age 89, living in Arizona. Judge Commander Thomas Hartwell, died 1963. Lieutenant Commander Morrison, died 1981. They interviewed Marsh and DeWitt. Both initially denied everything, but confronted with Estelle's documentation, with Klaus Reinhardt's preserved testimony, with the physical evidence of 3 bodies weighted with chains, they eventually confessed. Marsh went first. "It was wartime," he said. "We thought they were saboteurs. Callahan said they damaged the ship. We believed him. We followed orders." "What orders?" the investigators asked. "To make them talk, to find out if there were more of them. We didn't mean to kill them. It got out of hand." DeWitt's story was similar. __quote_94__. Both men were too old for prosecution. The statute of limitations had long expired. But their names were made public, their confessions documented, their dishonorable discharges issued posthumously, erasing the honorable service records they'd maintained for decades. The families of the 6 documented victims received official apologies from the Department of the Navy. The convictions of Pritchard, Santos, Chen, and Kozlowski were posthumously overturned. Dorothy Sullivan's discharge was changed from dishonorable to honorable. In 2018, after 3 years of investigation, the Navy issued a comprehensive report acknowledging systematic falsification of military court records during World War II, particularly in cases involving ethnic minorities and those who reported misconduct by superior officers. Part 16. The Memorial. In May 2019, a memorial was dedicated at the Mare Island Naval Shipyard, now a decommissioned historical site maintained by the City of Vallejo and the National Park Service. The ceremony was held on a warm spring day, the kind of day that makes you believe in renewal, in second chances. Hundreds of people attended, descendants of the victims, Japanese-American community leaders, veterans groups, historians, journalists, and ordinary citizens who believed that truth matters. The memorial consisted of 4 bronze plaques mounted on a granite wall overlooking the water where Dry Dock 3 had once stood. The first 3 plaques bore the names and photographs of the murdered men. Thomas Nakamura, 1918 to 1945, murdered at Mare Island Naval Shipyard, February 18, 1945. Loyal American. Loving son and brother. Justice delayed but not denied. James Fujimoto, 1914 to 1945. Murdered at Mare Island Naval Shipyard, February 18, 1945. Devoted husband and father. Patriot. Truth silenced but not forgotten. Henry Tanaka, 1921 to 1945. Murdered at Mare Island Naval Shipyard, February 18, 1945. Young man of promise and courage. His story will be told. The 4th plaque was smaller, made of black granite instead of bronze. It read, Estelle Vogel, 1917 to 1982. Translator, witness, guardian of truth. She wrote it down when everyone else looked away. She kept the record when silence was safer. She preserved the truth for 37 years, believing that someday Someone would care. At the dedication, Thomas Nakamura's sister Margaret spoke. She was 91 years old, frail but clear-eyed. She'd been 17 when her brother disappeared, had spent 74 years not knowing what happened to him. "For most of my life, I thought my brother was a deserter," she said, her voice wavering but strong. "I thought he'd run away, abandoned his family, his duty. The shame of that followed me my whole life. But now I know the truth. He was murdered. And this woman, Estelle Vogel, who I never met, who died before I knew her name, she kept his story safe. She made sure we would know. That's a kind of courage I can barely comprehend." James Fujimoto's daughter, Carol, now 76, spoke about growing up without a father, being told he'd deserted. "I'm grateful," she said, "that before I die I can know the truth about him. That he was brave, that he was loyal, that he loved us. Ms. Vogel gave me that gift." Henry Tanaka's nephew Robert read a statement on behalf of the family. __quote _101 Dr. Patricia Morrison spoke about the historical significance of Estelle's notebook, how it provided documentation of wartime injustices that would otherwise have been lost. "Primary sources like this are incredibly rare," she said. "Most truth gets buried and stays buried. Estelle Vogel made sure this truth survived." At the end of the ceremony, 3 doves were released over the water, one for each murdered man. They flew west, toward the Pacific, toward home. Epilogue. The Legacy. Estelle's notebook is preserved now at the National Archives in San Francisco, in a climate-controlled room with other vital historical documents. It sits behind glass, like a sacred relic. Researchers can request to view it, wearing white gloves, turning the pages carefully. 140 pages filled with small, precise handwriting. 6 cases documented in painful detail. Dual testimony, truth and lies, side by side. Students come to study it. Historians cite it in their work. Japanese-American families visit, wanting to see the evidence that finally cleared their relatives' names. There's a permanent exhibit about Estelle at the Oakland Museum of California. It includes her photograph from her Navy Translator ID badge. Young, serious, unremarkable. A woman you could pass on the street and never notice. The exhibit includes samples from her notebook, blown up so visitors can read her meticulous handwriting. It includes the letter she wrote before she died. __quote _104 The exhibit asks questions. What is the cost of silence? What is the price of truth? When is bearing witness enough, and when is it complicity? There are no simple answers. Every year on March 22nd, the anniversary of Klaus Reinhardt's testimony, a small memorial service is held at Mountain View Cemetery, where Estelle and Warren are buried. Not many people attend, but some do. Descendants of the victims she documented, historians who study her work, ordinary people who believe that truth matters more than comfort. They bring flowers. They read passages from her notebook aloud. They remember a woman who spent her life being invisible, who signed lies to survive, who kept a secret record of truth for 37 years. Was she a hero? She would have said no. She'd have said she was a coward who waited too long, who let guilty men die in their beds, who traded justice for survival. But the people who visit her grave see it differently. They see a woman who did what she could with what she had, who wrote it down when speaking would have meant death, who kept faith with truth even when truth had no power, who believed, despite everything, that someday justice would matter again. Her notebook survived. So did she, not in life, but in legacy. The truth she preserved changed history, brought justice to the dead, gave voice to the silenced. In a world where silence is easier than speech, where comfort is safer than truth, where forgetting is simpler than remembering, people like Estelle, however flawed, however compromised, are all that stand between us and oblivion. She kept the record. That's all any of us can do. Bear witness. Write it down. Trust that someday someone will care enough to look. Estelle Vogel did that, and it was enough.